Welcome aboard, all. We're about to embark upon a trilogy of discussions that aim to give us a better understanding of the late Bronze Age collapse. It's a topic that could easily take up more time and space, and it has elsewhere in podcasts and other talks that I'm sure you can find. But hopefully by the conclusion of our time together here, you'll have a decent grasp on the broad strokes of what took place and why. By way of introduction here, my name is Brandon. I'm the captain over at the Maritime History Podcast. Our discussions on my podcast approach history from a nautical perspective. So you might notice through these talks that we focus somewhat heavily on maritime and naval aspects of history. There are many other great sources on the other elements of the late Bronze Age collapse out there. So if our talks here intrigue you, definitely go seek out some further reading to help round out your understanding of these events. One final note. I make reference throughout this talk to things that we, quote, discussed previously. And when I'm mentioning that, I'm alluding to something that we talked about previously over on the podcast that I run. These series of talks about the late Bronze Age collapse were about 20 episodes deep in our podcast, so there's a lot of backstory or other things that build up to this time period in history. To get that whole backstory, maybe go take a listen to the podcast, see the other things that we talk about in ancient maritime history leading up to the end of the Bronze Age. But I think even without some of that backstory and additional listening, these talks here should be easy to follow as standalone talks, a trilogy, if you will. So, with all that said, let's dive in. A good place to begin today is with the city of Ugarit. This city will be somewhat central to our story today. It's a city that doesn't get a whole lot of attention when it comes to talk about Bronze Age history, at least not outside academic circles the way that some of the other major cities do. Ugarit is among the oldest of cities on Earth. It was occupied in Neolithic times, and archaeologists have dated its oldest fortified wall to around 6000 BCE. The city reached its pinnacle period beginning in 1800 BCE, and as for its end, well, we'll come to that briefly. Ugarit was situated on a headland or cape in northern Syria, which put it in prime location to be a trade center for the region there. What's more, this port city also sat at the perfect location to serve as an entrepot for the overland trade route to the Tigris and Euphrates. All in all, Ugarit was a trade center utilized by just about every Bronze Age civilization to some degree. It has been called the premier international port of its time. It's also been called the Hamburg or Rotterdam of the late Bronze Age. Now, there's a remarkable letter found in this city of Ugarit that introduces us by name to a wealthy merchant who lived in that city. His name was Sinaranu, and right around the year 1260 BCE, we know that he sent a ship over to Crete. This trade connection between a Levantine city and an Aegean island is something that we have seen a few times now. So this really shouldn't surprise us too much that there's the connection between these two places. The intriguing aspect of this letter is that it's an official letter. It's a declaration that upon returning to Ugarit, Sinaranu's ship full of grain, beer, and olive oil, his shipment is exempt from the standard royal tax. Now, I guess this could be some Bronze Age tax incentive at work, a palace official, or the king maybe seeking to incentivize trade. This actually seems to have been a common practice in Ugarit and in some of the cultures of this time and place. We have other texts that exempt other merchants from tax on their trade with Egypt, with the Hittites, and with another land that the name is just smudged beyond legibility. We're not sure who they were trading with. Now, this trade with the Hittites does make sense because the royal house of Ugarit was actually a vassal state of the Hittite Empire. It was allied by marriage, but it still, we see documentation in the ancient records that they send lavish amounts of tribute to the Hittite capital city of Hattusha. Sinaranu's ship sailed around 1260, we said, so trade was definitely alive and well at this time. Egypt and the Hittites had clashed at Kadesh in 1275 BCE, but they subsequently hashed out a treaty after that conflict. Meanwhile, in this time, the Mycenaeans honed their raiding skills along the western coasts of Anatolia, possibly fighting the Trojan War or whatever conflict has the roots of that mythology. Nevertheless, whatever you want to say about the Trojan War, we definitely see evidence that the Mycenaeans were active in their sphere of the Mediterranean and that their action was stirring up trouble for those cultures further to the east. We have speculated that the Mycenaean meddling in Anatolia can be seen as coinciding with the emergence of Cyclopean architecture at the Mycenaean palace cities around the Aegean. This was basically the addition of great walls around the previously unfortified palaces of the Mycenaean culture. The stones that were used for these giant wall fortifications, they were so large that people who came afterwards assumed that the walls were built by the mythical Cyclopes, hence the term today that we call it Cyclopean architecture. One possible interpretation for the emergence of these Mycenaean fortifications is that their palaces had become vulnerable in a way that they had not been vulnerable before. Thus, fortifications became necessary. As has been a running theme for us, though, we don't know the direct causes behind why these fortifications were built when they were and why they tend to pop up in various Mycenaean cities. We just see the symptoms, we see the emergence of this architecture, but the actual root causes are still a little bit hidden beneath the surface of the past. All right, we have visited Ugarit today, and we've established some bearings in the late Bronze Age, roughly. So where are we going to head from here? This time frame is, maybe one of the most difficult that we've tried to cover yet. So I think that it'll be beneficial for us if we try to sketch out a bird's eye view of what is about to happen, sketch some rough lines, just so we can get a lay of the land. After we know some of what's to come, the details will hopefully make a lot more sense, and they won't necessarily seem like we're fixated on one tree to the detriment of the greater forest. Lastly, keep in mind that this series of events is just the best way that current archaeology can reconstruct the timeline based on what they have found so far in academic work and study. This is clearly not the entire historical record. There's much more out there to be found, but this is the best theory that currently stands based on what has been found to date. Now, we're going to sketch in some rough date markers as well, and these dates are useful in giving us a theory about how the late Bronze Age collapse might have played out, in a rough chronology. And the years, the dating is accurate based on most chronologies, but there is some dispute. The chronologies don't line up perfectly in every instance, so there is a little bit of flexibility in this time frame. There's some margin for error, but still, as I've said, this rough chronology is pretty widely agreed upon as being the best picture of the theories of how the late Bronze Age collapse did in fact play out. So, with that brief caveat, let's jump into a bullet point summary of the current theory, and then we'll zoom in on some fascinating detail. Our looks at the Bronze Age world have shown us that from at least 1500 BCE, the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean were heavily involved in a complex international trade of raw materials and finished goods, trade that grew in complexity as the societies that engaged in the trade themselves prospered and grew. We call this entire period the Bronze Age because bronze weaponry and instruments were the central pillar of the trade networks and societal growth. Bronze is a composite of copper and tin, and as we saw from the evidence of shipwrecks at Uluburun and Cape Geladonia, copper and tin were traded in their raw and in their finished forms both. Now, I'm not sure personally how much stock to place in this statement, but an archaeologist and a scientist named Carol Bell, she focuses on the Bronze Age collapse in her work. She has an interesting take on the economics of the Bronze Age and what drove the ultimate collapse. In her view, tin in the Bronze Age held a similar strategic importance to crude oil in today's economies. It was a pillar of exchange, and it was the key piece to help maintain stability across the global economy. Now, I think this is worth alluding to here. It will come up in greater detail later in our story about the collapse. We took a pretty focused look at the Uluburun shipwreck. It has been dated to 1300 BCE, and we also looked at the wreck found at Cape Galadonia, which is dated closer to 1200. The Uluburun wreck proved to be a pretty wealthy shipwreck in terms of the goods that the ship was carrying on board at the time it went down. So we know, based on evidence from this wreck site, that high-level and high-value trade was continuing in the year 1300 and even after that, and that Levantine merchants were still quite active. In our look at the basis for the Trojan War myth, we also saw that Mycenaean raiders were active in Anatolia for much of the Bronze Age, although things seem to have picked up after the year 1300 BCE, with more signs of fighting and destruction in Anatolia. This can be looked at in relation to two main points. One, after 1300 BCE, the Hittite Empire had begun to decline in power. Then two, at the same time, the Mycenaean palace centers, which were city-states roughly, they also seem to have seen trouble. Earthquake damage is evident, and signs of economic stress begin to emerge in the record. It's in 1280 BCE that we have our first mention of a group that was part of what came to be known as the Sea Peoples. The Shardana are mentioned by name on a stele from Tanis, which is in the Nile Delta. It's a place where Ramesses II claimed to have defeated, quote, the rebellious Shardana in a sea battle. The assumption is that Ramesses must have taken some of the Shardana captive after he defeated them, because there are inscriptions in his name regarding the Battle of Kadesh in 1275, where he mentions them again. But this time he says that they fought for him as part of his personal bodyguard. We skip ahead now to 1250 BCE, the point at which some historians and theories locate the historical basis for the Trojan War. Mycenaean palaces and the city of Troy itself show signs of destruction by earthquake. We have talked about this in pretty great detail already, so the main point is to re-emphasize that the centralized, palace-controlled Mycenaean economies were beginning to weaken. This can explain at least part of their forays into Anatolia to capture slaves and goods there. However, such raiding would only provide a temporary solution. In 1230 BCE now, the Hittite army was defeated by the Assyrians at the Battle of Neheria. The Hittite defeat didn't destroy their empire immediately, but it consigned the empire to an impending collapse, and it signaled a shift of power away from the Hittites. Within 30 years, they would be completely off the scene. Before the final destruction, we have record that in 1210 BCE, the Hittite king had to fight off an invasion fleet coming from the direction of Cyprus. He employed ships from Ugarit in making his defense, which was ultimately successful, but the invasion itself shows that the island of Cyprus had become a staging ground for invasion, and that the king of Cyprus had lost control of at least part of the island there. In fact, it's likely that Cyprus had been a staging point for seaborne raiders for a substantial portion of the Bronze Age, though the frequency and the severity does seem to have increased late on. 3 years later, in 1207 BCE, we see the first mention of the group that we commonly call the Sea Peoples. We will look in detail at the various inscriptions that describe this invasion later on in our trilogy series here. The inscriptions summarily describe an invasion of Egypt by what they refer to as Libyans, along with a group that they refer to as the Sea Peoples, or Peoples of the Sea. This group was made up of 5 or 6 separate ethnic groups that are listed on Egyptian monuments, and which give us some pretty good insight into where these invaders may have come from, and even why. By 1200 BCE, though, things had well and truly come unraveled. Earthquakes had rocked the Aegean and portions of the Mediterranean since 1225. Famine and drought had turned into an undeniable problem around the Bronze Age world. The dates for city destructions vary around the regions, but it's clear that by 1200, many cities had already been destroyed or abandoned for various reasons. Perhaps the chief of these was Hattusha, the capital of the Hittite Empire. It was destroyed and subsequently abandoned in 1200. The Hittite Empire itself would not be rediscovered for another 3,700 years. Destructions continued for a period of decades, though again, we will be more specific as we continue the talk here. Ugarit was destroyed in 1190 BCE, and the ruins of this once great trade center have recently revealed a wealth of textual evidence that gives us some insight into the dying moments of a Bronze Age city. Then, in 1180 BCE, destruction of city and palace centers becomes even more pronounced in Mycenaean Greece. Pylos is ruined, as is Troy 7a. In the ensuing years, yet more palace centers are abandoned or destroyed, among them Boeotia, Tiryns, Lefkandi, Kynos, and then Mycenae itself. Then, perhaps what is the most remarkable and the most revealing event of the Late Bronze Age occurs in 1177 BCE. Inscriptions from the mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu tell and show us a great series of battles between Egypt and the Sea Peoples. Some of these battles happen on land, while a breathtaking inscription depicts a chaotic naval battle that Egypt again claims to have won. The effects of the Late Bronze Age collapse continue to play themselves out even past 1177, which is the last mention of the Sea Peoples in the Egyptian record. The Assyrians become dominant, and the Egyptians retain a smaller measure of their once great power. The Levant sees a shakeup, and it's thought that a substantial portion of the Sea Peoples eventually settle there to the north of Egypt. It's from this region that eventually the Phoenicians will become a great maritime power in their own right. Meanwhile, a period of decline occurs in the Aegean. Now, I don't prefer to use the term Dark Ages, but I think it's a pretty succinct term that we can use to broadly describe the post-Bronze Age era in Greece and in a few other places around the Near East and the Mediterranean regions. Alright, that's my summary of the bullet points, so we have, somewhat of a roadmap going forward. What we can say at the outset of our discussion here is that we know fairly well how things operated at the height of the Bronze Age, the year 1300 or so, and even in the century before that. We know pretty fairly well how things ended up around 200 years later, 1100 BCE, at which point the Cyclades were largely abandoned, mass migration and shift had occurred, and the Assyrians were by that point powerful, with the Phoenicians emerging to their south. Our focus now is going to be on the jumbled mess of what could possibly have happened in those intervening years, especially in the century between 1250 and 1150 BCE. As I included in the list a moment ago, The first clear mention of a seaborne threat connected to the enigmatic Sea Peoples is found on a pair of stelae commissioned by Ramesses II. Both of them refer to an incident that happened around 1280 BCE. Let's go ahead and take each of these in turn. The stele found at Aswan recounts Ramesses' claim to have, quote, destroyed the warriors of the Great Green, so as to let Egypt spend the night sleeping peacefully. It's fairly well established by historical work that in naming the Great Green, Egypt refers here to the Mediterranean, at least in the context of this inscription. This inscription from Aswan then tells us that Egypt was invaded by seaborne warriors coming from the Mediterranean. It is the second stele, which was found at Tanis in the Nile Delta, that affixes a name to these warriors, a people that Ramesses calls the Shurdin or the Shardana, depending on the translation. On this second artifact, Ramesses tells us this story. Quote, as for the Shurdin of rebellious mind, whom none could ever fight against, who came bold-hearted in warships from the midst of the sea, those whom none could withstand, he, Ramesses, plundered them by the victories of his valiant arm, they being carried off to Egypt as prisoners. Now, I'm definitely not an Egyptologist, and I'm certainly in the dark when it comes to hieroglyphics, but in a fascinating paper about the ships used by the Sea Peoples, archaeologist Jeff Emanuel points out that the inscription on the Tanis stele describes the clash with the Shurdin in a unique way. It appears that the Egyptians writing this inscription had to invent a new word to describe the types of ships that were used by the Shurdin. It's a term that we roughly translate as warship, or more literally, ships of fighting. This is a little bit strange, as Emmanuel points out, since the Egyptians had certainly used ships in a military setting before, and they were pretty intimately familiar with many types of sailing vessels, as we have seen in our talks about Egyptian maritime history. Now, I apologize for tantalizing you with this tidbit right now, but it can only be fleshed out later on toward the end of the events involving the Sea Peoples, since it's only late on that we have a depiction of their ships that can help inform this new word that the Shurdin forced Egypt to conjure up by way of describing their ships. I think this is a little sneak peek of something we'll talk about later on. There is solid evidence from the later depictions that the Sea Peoples did indeed sail on a unique and more developed type of ship. So do come back for part 2 and part 3 of our trilogy, where we'll get more fully into that discussion. Moving on from the appearance of Shurdin and their defeat by Ramesses II in 1280, it's interesting to see them pop up again only 5 years later. This time, they are connected with Egypt still, but they fight in a battle on Egypt's side on this second appearance. The battle that is in question is none other than the significant Battle of 75 when Egypt clashes with the Hittites at the extreme edge of their respective empires. This is a region that each of the empires hoped to bring more fully within its control. The battle happened in Kadesh, hence the name of the battle. This places it in modern-day Syria. So even more than 3,000 years ago, world empires made Syria the site of their struggle for power. I find that I'm saying this more often as the podcast progresses, but some things never change. There's nothing new under the sun. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Really, whatever phrase you want to throw in here, I think will apply. Anyhow, the detailed records of what Ramesses claimed as his victory at Kadesh tell us that a contingent of Shurdin warriors fought as part of the personal bodyguard of Ramesses himself. We have no proof, but it seems reasonable to think that he'd taken some prisoners in the first battle with the Sheridan and incorporated them into his bodyguard. Now, we could get into looking at some of the depictions of the Sheridan at this battle. There are image depictions of them from the Egyptian record, but for our purposes, I think that would bog us down a little bit. I think they're easy to find online if you are curious to look more. Just look up even the Wikipedia page for the Battle of Kadesh. It'll get you some good links to academic discussion and analysis of the inscriptions about this battle. The other relevant info to come from Kadesh is that two groups that later would fall under the heading of Sea Peoples were fighting against Egypt. They were fighting for the Hittites at Kadesh. These two groups were called the Karkasha and the Luka. The Karkasha don't really pop up too much after this that I have been able to track down. It would be a bit esoteric to get into looking at them too much. But the Luka should sound familiar to you, back from our discussion on episode 14 of the podcast. This group was variously described by the Hittites and the Mycenaeans as pirates, raiders, really all-around rebels. They occupied southern Anatolia, and their name likely stuck around in that region, the area that later comes to be called Lycia or Lycia. It makes sense, considering their Anatolian origin, that the Luka would have fought for the Hittites. They likely had a vassal state treaty with the king, as did the Dardanoi, who also fought for Hattusha at the Battle of Kadesh. So maybe we even have the Proto-Sea Peoples fighting alongside the Trojans and others for the Hittites against the Egyptians on a battlefield in Syria. Again, some strangely eerie echoes of the modern day to be found in the Bronze Age record here. It seems, however, that these Bronze Age powers who fought at Kadesh knew that the geopolitical situation was irreversibly against them at this point. There were a few more skirmishes in the Levant, where Ramesses took some cities from the Hittites, and the Hittites took some others back from Ramesses. 15 years after the Battle of Kadesh, though, the Hittites and the Egyptians hashed out a treaty. This rather remarkable treaty, dated to around 1260 BCE, seems to have been a move by the Hittites to bring their war with Egypt to a halt. Not because they wanted to, necessarily, but because they had a much bigger problem, much closer to home. It is at this point in the story that things begin to get well and truly murky from a historian's point of view. That's because there's no explicit mention of the Sea Peoples in Egypt for quite a while. And, well, okay, I should clarify something at this stage. The term Sea Peoples wasn't used until Ramesses III fought these people later on, in the year 1177. Before that time, we simply have mention of various smaller people groups that are then eventually and ultimately lumped together in those records that relate to 1177, the records that describe a group comprised of these various peoples who enter Egypt together in a sort of confederation. Even then, though, the Sea Peoples were not one ethnic group, not even close. They were a conglomeration of displaced peoples from around the Bronze Age world, looking for a new home in all likelihood. Now that we're clear on the technical usage of the term Sea Peoples, let's talk a bit about why they might have left their homes to begin with, why they were on the move, and some of them on the move as early as 1280 BCE, but a much larger portion of them not for another 100 years or so after that. So, as I had begun saying, it's around 1250 BCE that the story really begins to get murky for us. We talked earlier about how it's at this point that the precariously balanced economic and political structure of the Mycenaean city-states begins to tip in the wrong direction. Their raiding in Anatolia signals this, as does the appearance of their Cyclopean architecture. This uptick in defensive building seems to have been prompted by a wave of destruction at various locales around the Aegean in the years right around 1250 BCE. Thebes was destroyed, and there are indications that a portion of Mycenae was also burned. Some theorize that this wave of attacks is what prompted the Mycenaeans to build their Cyclopean defensive works, particularly at the site of Mycenae. However, this is just a guess. Not much happens as far as invasion in the Aegean in the decades following 1250, but it appears that over in the region of the Hittites' power, the situation there continued to decline after 1250. This decline over there culminated in the Battle of Neheria in 1230 BCE, which was basically the death knell of the Hittite Empire, although it continued to limp along for a few decades after the battle. The battle was itself the culmination of a conflict between the Hittites in Anatolia and the rising power of the Middle Assyrian Empire in Mesopotamia. These two powers clashed over control of the region in between them, a region that had previously been controlled by the Mitanni. The city of Neheria lay on the Tigris River in the southeastern corner of modern-day Turkey. So, to make a long and complicated story short, the Assyrians won a huge victory at this battle, a victory that shifted the balance of power in the region away from the Hittites and toward the Assyrian king Tukulti-Ninurta. It's interesting then to note something that the historian Eric Klein points out, something that we know from other sources, which is that the Hittites and the Mycenaeans didn't get along very well. If we keep this point in mind, it's interesting to note that after the victory at the Battle of Neheria, there's some evidence that the Assyrian king sent a generous gift of lapis lazuli to the Mycenaean king of Thebes. It's a little hard to read too much into this, but I think it's interesting to note. The last major item of concern for us in our first part here today is to see how the Hittites reacted to their defeat and how it might connect and be evidence of more Mycenaean campaigns of raids along Anatolia's western coast. The Hittite reaction to their defeat by Assyria came in the form of a treaty with the king of Amurru. Amurru was a kingdom that extended to the coasts of northern Syria. Taking into account the fact that the Assyrian Empire didn't have any direct access to the Mediterranean, we can connect some of the dots here to see that by making treaty with Amurru, the Hittites were really trying to cut off Assyria's trade access to the Mediterranean, and in particular, their access to the goods coming from the Mycenaean sphere. We have a text of the treaty, actually, and this goal of cutting off Hittite access to Mycenaean goods is spelled out pretty clearly. The first place is right at the beginning of the treaty. It begins by laying out the parties to the treaty, and it says, quote, "And the kings who are of the same rank as myself, the king of Egypt, the king of Babylonia, the king of Assyria," and then there's a party that is intentionally crossed out, but we know through textual analysis that it originally named the king of Ahiawa. This word Ahiawa was the Hittite name for a kingdom to their west, a place that many historians associate with the Mycenaean culture. Apparently in 1225 BCE then, the general time that this treaty was written, the Hittites didn't consider the Mycenaeans to be their friends, nor were the Assyrians. So in this case, we have the old, my friend's enemy is my enemy type situation. The Hittite king who drafted this treaty said it pretty clearly, but in converse terms. His scribe wrote in the treaty, throughout he used the word your, and this refers to how the Hittites expected the king of Amurru to act. Quote, "If the king of Egypt is the friend of my majesty, he shall be your friend. But if he is the enemy of my majesty, he shall be your enemy. And if the king of Babylonia is the friend of my majesty, he shall be your friend. But if he is the enemy of my majesty, he shall be your enemy. Since your merchant shall not go to Assyria, and you shall not allow his merchant into your land, he shall not pass through your land. But if he should come into your land, seize him, and send him off to me. Let this matter be placed under oath for you." So, although it might be a little hard to follow the players here as we read through the treaty and the situation, what it boils down to is that there's a treaty of cooperation, and that the Hittites are trying to cut off Assyria's access to trade on the Mediterranean. This is made pretty explicit in a later line where the Hittite king says flat out, quote, "You shall not allow any ship of Ahhiyawa to go to him." The him being the king of Assyria. We've seen the text of the treaty then and tried to outline its significance, and it seems that in large part the Hittites at this stage of history, around 1225, they were coming under pressure from all sides. Thus, their need to barter the treaty here with the king of Amurru. They apparently hoped to neutralize the growing strength of the Assyrians to their east, but they still weren't friends with the Mycenaeans and their harsh language to refer to the Mycenaeans here. Ahhiyawa was the term in the treaty, but their harsh language for Ahhiyawa shows us that they did still have problems to the west also. With the Hittites kind of boxed in then, I think that'll be a good stopping point for us today. I do hope you'll come back for part 2 of the trilogy though. Next time, we are going to take a look at how these weren't the only threats hounding the ever-shrinking edges of the Hittite Empire. More threats come from the south, born on the Mediterranean Sea, possibly emanating from the island of Cyprus. We will look at that next time, as well as the role that Ugarit played in the dying stages of the Hittite Empire. Plus, the growing destruction that swept the Bronze, some of it at the hands of the Sea Peoples, some of it not. That is the rough plan for part 2, and then part 3 will focus pretty much entirely on the Sea Peoples, their conflicts with Egypt, and the record that we have of those conflicts, and then ultimately the end of the Bronze Age. I hope that all sounds good. Thank you for your time today, and I hope you'll join us next time.